Awesome. So we're in Luke chapter 16 today. And as I study the Bible, I'm beginning to recognize that one of the biggest mistakes that I believe we've made is adding chapters and verses in the Bible. Of how, by not reading the story in sequence, we have misunderstood the parables that Jesus was telling. Some of the popular stories and parables that we grew up listening to, that I grew up reading, I think we've misunderstood them because we've read them in isolation and not as a continuation. Literally misunderstood this for years. And even I began to search commentaries just to see if I wasn't losing my mind, and nobody could explain it. Even the famous parable of the prodigal son, it was an interruption. Luke 16, the parable of the shrewd manager, or other translation says the unjust manager. And so we're going to be reading this chapter from a different lens, which will give us a different interpretation of this parable and the other one. You've probably heard this, the Rich Man and Lazarus, right? They're actually connected, but we're going to explore why Jesus is speaking to his disciples here. Why does Luke 16 start like this? And I feel like that's one of the parables that has really confused a lot of people, because this man was unjust and it feels like he's being commended for his lack of responsibility. And I'd always read this parable believing that the rich man was referring to God or Jesus. Realized may not be talking about Jesus after all. Luke chapter 16. Remember that Luke, in Luke chapter 1, already gave us a context for why he's writing his letter. He's writing to Theophilus because he's trying to provide an orderly account for the life of Jesus that he had been taught. Theophilus was probably a new believer. He had read the eyewitness accounts. He had probably read Matthew and Mark's account, and there were just gaps in their stories that he couldn't put two and two together. It's like, why did this happen? And so Luke, who is a doctor, a physician, like he's trained not just to accept the symptoms of a sickness. He's not just trained to accept what he's seen on you physically. He's trained to drill down into the root cause, because he needs to know the cause, what is causing the symptoms that I'm seeing. Because as a doctor, he realizes that if you do not know what is causing something, then you cannot really fix it. And so as we're studying Luke's account, you can tell that he has done a lot of investigation. And there's a reason why I'm prefacing this like this, because Luke, because he's trying to give an orderly account, when a new thing happens, he's always sure to put a mark there. He's always sure to introduce a new story in a certain way. He will say, on a Sabbath, this happened. On another Sabbath, this happened. When Jesus was here, whenever there was a transition, he was sure to reveal that translation or that transition. And so when I was studying Luke 16, and it started off with Jesus told his disciples, again, because we know from meditating on the word long enough now that chapters and verses were added after for ease of reference. But we've also seen that these chapters and verses have become problematic in a way because it is cutting in between conversations. And so when you pick the Bible and you say, oh, let me just read Luke 16, you are reading the latter part of a story without really understanding that it is part of a conversation. It is not a story in isolation, because this conversation did not start here. This conversation did not even start in Luke 15. This conversation started in Luke chapter 14. This is a continuation. We saw how Jesus was at a Pharisee's house, a prominent Pharisee, where he healed a man who had dropsy. Right after that situation in verse 25, Luke says large crowds were traveling with Jesus. That's going to be important here. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus. And turning to them, Jesus said, now, why is Jesus about to teach them about giving up things if they are going to follow him? Why is he then teaching about becoming a disciple? Is it possible that there are large crowds that are following Jesus, and Jesus at this point is like, a lot of these guys are following me because they think by following me, they automatically become my disciples. I need to correct or clarify what is going on here, because this large crowd, they weren't just following, they began to travel with him, just like his disciples would travel. And so if he's stopping his trip to have a conversation or to instruct them in something, it is indicative of the fact that he's trying to pass a message across to clarify something. Don't just feel like because you're following me from place to place that you've automatically become a disciple. And so Jesus begins to tell them that if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life, such a person cannot become my disciple. He's trying to correct the assumptions here. That is a difference between following me and becoming my disciple. Following me is not just saying, oh, I'm taking 2 days off work just to see who this miracle worker or who this teacher is. Following me means denying everything. Following me requires you to make me your priority. Jesus is not an add-on to your life. He's first place. And so Jesus is telling them that you need to count the cost before making that decision, which is why he says that suppose one of you wants to build a tower, won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Count the cost before following me, because this decision to become my disciple is going to cost you your close relationships, opportunities, pre-existing desires and goals. All this will need to be submitted. Count the cost before you make the decision. Now, here's why I'm sharing this, because at the very last verse of Luke 14, he said, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Now, what is Jesus? There's a crowd following him. He has turned to them, giving them the prerequisites for becoming a disciple. And then he ends that teaching saying, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. What's he saying? Whoever understands, come closer so you can hear some more. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Now, check out how Luke 15 starts. And there's a reason why I'm showing this, because again, Luke is the one writing this book, and Luke is very intentional with the way he's writing. If Luke chapter 15 was going to be a different scenario, he would have specified that on another day, guys, we're breaking down the Bible. Like, you're going to see what I mean in a second. Luke 15 starts off with, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. How did Luke 14 end? He who has ears, let him hear. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. What was his message? If you want to become my disciple, he who has ears, let him hear. So if you want to become my disciple, those who want to become my disciple, come closer and hear. Now the tax collectors and sinners came forward. They began gathering around to hear Jesus. Why did the Pharisees get upset here? Verse 2 says, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Why did they say welcomes? Is it possible that the tax collectors and sinners were coming forward because they were communicating their intention to possibly become disciples? And the Pharisees understood this, and they're like, he's going to welcome these kinds of people? Again, Jesus is teaching them about becoming disciples. People have come forward to hear more about what is going to cost them, or hear more about what it's going to be a disciple. Now, the Pharisees interrupt Jesus' teaching through their muttering. Now, this is what introduced the parables. The popular parable of the prodigal son, the lost sheep, the lost silver coin, it was an interruption. It was because of what the Pharisees did that Jesus now said, let me address what they are doing, because they began to mutter, they began to complain, they began to talk, and there's a crowd here. And so Jesus is like, you know what? Let me address this. It says this one welcomes sinners and eats with them. Jesus then proceeds to tell them 3 parables back to back. So he tells them the first parable about the lost sheep, 1 out of 100. And it says, I didn't come for the 99, I came for the 1. I came for the repentant ones. Now you see, these tax collectors and the sinners, they had a repentant heart. They had been following, they heard Jesus give a roll call for discipleship. They've gathered around to hear more. Something is drawing them to him. And so Jesus gives these parables. And so he gives the parable of the lost sheep, then proceeds to give the parable of the lost coin, then proceeds to give the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. This was all an interruption.